The Operator Log, Episode 10, What We've Learned. The Stewardship Model, the human role in an autonomous business. Autonomy does not eliminate the human role, it redefines it. In Episode 2, we named the Stewardship Model and said we would cover it in full in Episode 10. We are 8 episodes later. This is Episode 10. The Stewardship Model has appeared across the arc in different forms. In Episode 3, we described what a steward's week looks like when operational drag is below 5%. In Episode 7, we introduced it as the human consequence of the agentic core, the operating principle that makes one operator viable in place of a team. In Episode 9, we named the steward's role in a failure event. Not operational firefighting, but architectural improvement. Each of those appearances was a partial view. This episode is the complete one. Autonomy does not eliminate the human role. It redefines it. An autonomous business is not a business without people. It is a business where people are no longer the units of labor. The stewardship model is the operating principle that defines what the human role becomes when the architecture no longer requires human execution, one competent operator overseeing an agentic stack, acting as the architect of the system rather than a participant in it. This is the operator log. The most persistent objection to autonomous business design is control. If humans are not approving every invoice, reviewing every output, and signing off every customer interaction, how does the business maintain quality? How do errors get caught before they compound? How does someone remain accountable for what the system produces? It is a reasonable concern, and it is based on a conflation of two things that are structurally different: execution and oversight. A human who approves every invoice is executing. They are a participant in the workflow, a step in the process that cannot be skipped without the process breaking. Their presence does not represent control in any strategic sense. It represents a dependency. Remove the human and the workflow fails. That is not a control architecture. That is a bottleneck with a job title. A steward who designed the logic that approves invoices deterministically, who defined the parameters, set the exception thresholds, and built the machine-readable interface through which the data flows, is exercising a fundamentally different kind of control. They did not approve the invoice. They govern the system that approves invoices. The distinction is between participating in a workflow and being responsible for the architecture that runs it. The steward has more control in the latter role, not less. They have designed out the need for their own presence in the loop, which means the loop runs whether they are watching or not, and fails safely when it encounters conditions it was not designed for. Most firms that recognize this in theory still land on what the memo for this episode calls the assistant model. The AI provides information, the human acts on it. Every lead capture triggers a notification that a human must action. Every service delivery requires human sign-off before it executes. Every invoice sits in a queue waiting for a human to press approve. This is not an autonomous business. It is a human operation with a faster information layer on top of it. The coordination task is still running at full rate. The human is still the throughput constraint. The only thing that has changed is that the human's inputs arrive faster than they did before. We established the 80% threshold in Episode 2 as the structural line that separates these two models. When more than 80% of cross-departmental handoffs execute without human intervention, the human role shifts from labor to stewardship. Below that threshold, you have not built an autonomous business. You have built an automated one with additional steps, and the coordination tax compounds with every unit of growth exactly as it did before the technology was deployed. The 80% threshold is not a performance aspiration. It is the architectural condition that makes the stewardship model possible. Below it, the human is in the workflow. Above it, the human governs the workflow. Those are different roles, different workloads, and different economic relationships between headcount and revenue. Traditional firms use humans as the engine. Arco uses humans as the architect. The steward's day is not a traditional working day. There are no tasks to process, no requests to handle, no team to manage. There is a system to govern, and governing a system is a fundamentally different kind of work from running one. When the architecture is holding, when MTTI is above 72 hours and operational drag is below 5%, the steward's morning looks like this. They review the overnight execution divergence log, any agentic workflow that deviated by more than 15% from its predicted path was automatically halted and flagged. In a mature deployment, most mornings produce no alerts at all. When there is one, the steward reads the full context the system logged. The step at which the divergence occurred, the confidence score that triggered the threshold, the specific data input that produced the deviation. They diagnose which architectural layer generated the failure, a logic gate, an integration point, a calibration issue, and update the system logic so that the same class of exception is handled autonomously in future. That is the critical distinction. The steward does not fix the specific failed task. The recovery protocol handles that. The workflow halted at the last known good state, the queue accumulated, the exception was preserved for architectural review. The steward diagnoses why the failure occurred at the architectural level and eliminates the conditions that produced it. The steward does not repeat work. They eliminate the need for work to be repeated. When the architecture is not holding, when MTTI is declining, when exception frequency is rising, when ghost trial outputs are diverging from expected parameters, the steward's day is different. They are in diagnostic mode, reviewing the continuous regression loop data, identifying which component of the logic has drifted from its calibration, and tracing whether the drift is produced by a data environment shift or by a genuine logic failure. This is the steward at full operational intensity, not processing tasks, but performing architectural surgery on a live system. It is skilled, concentrated work. And because it is architectural rather than operational, each intervention reduces the frequency of the next one. When the architecture is not holding, when MTTI is declining, when exception frequency is rising, when ghost trial outputs are diverging from expected parameters, the steward's day is different. They are in diagnostic mode, reviewing the continuous regression loop data, identifying which component of the logic has drifted from its calibration, and tracing whether the drift is produced by a data environment shift or by a genuine logic failure. This is the steward at full operational intensity, not processing tasks, but performing architectural surgery on a live system. It is skilled, concentrated work. And because it is architectural rather than operational, each intervention reduces the frequency of the next one. This is the defining distinction between a steward and a manager. A manager coordinates people performing tasks. Their workload scales with the volume of what those people produce. More transactions require more coordination, more approvals, more oversight of human workers executing the work. The manager is a function of headcount. As the business grows, the manager's role grows with it. The steward's workload does not scale with the output volume. It scales with the frequency of novel exceptions, edge cases the system has not encountered before and cannot resolve within its current logic. The steward resolves each novel exception by updating the architecture, which means the same class of exception is handled autonomously in future. As the system matures and the architecture's coverage expands, novel exceptions become rarer. The steward becomes progressively less busy, not because the business is growing more slowly, but because the architecture is growing more capable. More transactions run through the same logic, handling more of the variation the real world produces, requiring the steward less often per unit of output. Arco measures the health of this model through MTTI, mean time to intervention. The average number of hours the core revenue loop runs without requiring a human decision. The architectural target is greater than 72 hours. A business that requires steward input every few hours is not autonomous. It is automated with a single human coordinator, and the coordinator is the bottleneck. A business that runs for 3 days surfaces a specific exception for architectural improvement and then runs for another 3 days is operating correctly. Architectural certainty is the state in which MTTI is consistently achieved. The stewardship model is the human architecture that makes it sustainable. The steward's role is not static. It evolves as the architecture matures, and the direction of that evolution is the clearest evidence that the stewardship model is working. In the early phase of a deployment, novel exceptions are frequent. The architecture has been designed for the condition the business is expected to encounter, but it has not yet been tested against the full range of conditions the real world produces. Every novel exception the system surfaces is one the architecture had not accounted for. A data input outside the expected distribution, an API returning a schema variant the machine-readable interface had not been built to handle, a customer request that falls between the defined parameters of two Tier 2 workflows. The steward resolves each one and updates the architecture. In the early phase, they are resolving exceptions frequently, sometimes daily. The MTTI is short. The business is not yet fully autonomous. As the architecture accumulates resolved exceptions, the system's coverage expands. The exceptions that were novel in the first month become handled cases in the third. The logic gates that required steward input twice a week in the first quarter require it twice a month in the second. MTT. I extends not because the business is encountering fewer edge cases in the real world, but because the architecture has learned to handle more of them without escalation. The steward's morning review produces fewer alerts. The diagnostic work becomes less frequent. The role shifts from reactive exception resolution toward the strategic architecture review, identifying categories of logic that could be strengthened before they produce exceptions, contributing documented learnings to the agentic core, and expanding agent authority in the tiers where the architecture has consistently demonstrated stability. This is what ARCO means when we say that every exception resolved makes the system more capable. The steward is not just maintaining the business, they are compounding it. Each resolution adds to the architecture's operational intelligence, and because that intelligence lives in the agentic core, it transfers to every subsequent ARCO deployment. The exception encountered in the logistics brokerage deployment becomes a handled case in the compliance processing deployment that follows. The steward in the second business does not encounter the same class of novel exception as the steward in the first, because the architecture they inherited already knows how to handle it. The arithmetical consequence of the stewardship model at scale is the 10-to-1 revenue to head count advantage we stated in episode 1. If a traditional service firm requires 50 human coordinators to generate 5 million in annual revenue, an ARCO business in the same market targets that revenue with 5 stewards. Not because the work is less complex, because the architecture is performing the coordination work that the 45 additional coordinators would otherwise perform. The coordination tax that accounts for 20 to 30% of the legacy firm's operating budget does not exist in the ARCO business. The stewards are not paying it. They designed it out. The question that follows is always whether an incumbent can adopt the stewardship model onto its existing architecture. The answer is precise, not without first resolving its legacy liability. The stewardship model requires the entire architecture to be designed for agentic execution from the start. Deterministic workflows, machine-readable interfaces, continuous regression loops, T-tier classification, the 80% threshold already crossed. Placing a steward over a workflow that still contains human-in-the-loop dependencies at most decision points does not produce a steward. It produces a manager with a more expensive toolset and a new job title. The model only functions when the architecture it governs is already capable of operating without the steward present. The stewardship model is a consequence of clean sheet agentic design. It is not a retrofit applied to legacy operations. What stewardship is not is also worth naming precisely. It is not prompt engineering, the tactical skill of crafting inputs to a single model interaction. The steward is not an AI user. They are the architect responsible for ensuring the system's logic aligns with the business's economic goals across its full operational surface. When a steward reviews an execution divergence alert, they are not rewriting a prompt. They are diagnosing which architectural layer produced the deviation and updating the logic so it does not recur. The distinction is between operating a tool and governing a system. The tool user's skill ceiling is the tool's capability. The system architect's ceiling is the architecture's ceiling, and the architecture by design is built to compound. What is the stewardship model and what does a steward do? The stewardship model is ARCO's operating principle for the human role in an autonomous business. A steward is a single competent operator who oversees an agentic stack, acting as the architect of the system rather than a participant in it. The steward does not perform tasks. They monitor execution divergence, handle exceptions that fall outside the system's defined parameters, and update the architecture so each class of exception is handled autonomously in future. The steward does not repeat work. They eliminate the need for work to be repeated. Performance target, mean time to intervention greater than 72 hours. Economic consequence, 10-to-1 revenue to head count advantage over industry benchmarks. 10 episodes. One argument developed from its foundations. Episode 1 established that an autonomous business decouples revenue from headcount by design. Episode 2 named the agentic architecture that makes that decoupling possible. Episode 3 showed what the coordination tax costs when you have not built it. Episode 4 explained why the MVP model produces exactly the architectural debt that autonomy requires you to never accumulate. Episode 5 identified the markets where the operational arbitrage is large enough to justify clean sheet construction. Episode 6 established why the incumbent in those markets cannot respond even when they see it coming. Episode 7 showed why the studio model, not the founder-led model, is the right vehicle for building autonomous businesses at scale. Episode 8 documented why ARCO publishes these decisions in public. Episode 9 described what happens when the architecture fails and how the system is designed to fail safely. All of it leads here. The stewardship model is the human consequence of every architectural decision that preceded it. When the autonomous business is designed correctly, when the 80% threshold is crossed, when MTTI exceeds 72 hours, when operational drag is below 5%. What the human does in that business is not what a manager does in a legacy firm. It is not execution. It is not coordination. It is stewardship, governing the architecture that runs the business, resolving the exceptions the architecture surfaces, and compounding the system's intelligence with every intervention. The future of work in autonomous businesses is not humans and agents collaborating on tasks. It is humans owning the outcomes and agents owning the execution. The steward sets the parameters, monitors the deviation, and resolves the exceptions that define the system's next improvement cycle. The agents run the revenue loop. The full written version of this argument is memo number 10, the stewardship model, on the blog at arcoventure.studio. Every term introduced across this 10-episode arc is defined precisely in the ARCO lexicon at arcoventure.studio/lexicon. Next week begins a different arc. Episode 11 covers engineering for liquidity. Why autonomous companies are the most structurally attractive acquisition targets, and how the decisions made at the design stage determine what they are worth at exit. At Arco, we do not scale by hiring more people to do more things. We scale by hiring better stewards to manage more logic. This has been episode 10 of the Operator Log.